Ouagadougou, October 18, 2025. Under the blinding Sahel sun, the courtyard of the presidential palace ripples, with green, red, yellow flags of Pan-African unity, beside the national banner of Burkina Faso. More than 300 delegates from 24 African nations assemble in disciplined lines. There are no luxury convoys, no gold chairs, only drums, a baobab tree in the center, and voices chanting in dozens of dialects, Africa for Africans. When Captain Ibrahim Traoré steps out, he is not wearing his decorated uniform. He wears a simple khaki shirt, sleeves rolled, dust still clinging to his boots. He raises the microphone and says calmly,
Bonjour.
"We have already bled for freedom. Now
Très
it is
heureux,
time
très
to
ému de
rebuild
vous
Africa
recevoir ce
with our
matin.
own hands."
Et je tiens à vous
On
dire
paper,
merci à tous
this was a
qui avaient fait le
ceremonial
déplacement de
reception.
Ouagadougou
In reality,
pour
it
nous
was a
soutenir,
geopolitical
nous
signal.
honorer et nous
For the
accompagner
first time in decades,
dans
a Sahel
cet
nation
événement
convened a
qui
Pan-African
n'est pas
assembly
forcément heureux,
without Western
mais un
sponsorship.
événement
No
interpellateur.
EU
Et
observers,
je pense que
no UN press team. What unfolded in that courtyard was not diplomacy. It was a declaration that the era of dependency was over. From an analytical standpoint, the message operated on three levels. First, it normalized a new South-South paradigm driven by civil society and youth movements, rather than foreign donors. Second, it built a deliberate aesthetic of resistance, Sankara's legacy, the baobab, the utilitarian khaki, all crafted to speak to a generation exhausted by the language of aid. Third, it introduced what might be called non-aligned realism, the idea that sovereignty requires listening, even to critics, not just allies, to forge legitimacy from within. The central question for observers, and the heartbeat of this entire report, is whether a symbolic meeting like this can translate into real architecture of cooperation, one capable of moving capital, technology, and collective confidence across a fractured continent. That day, in Ouagadougou, history seemed to breathe again. But history, as every analyst knows, only endures when symbolism turns into structure. Inside the Great Hall of Ouagadougou, the air was thick with expectation. Delegates from across the continent, from Ghana to Guinea, from South Africa to Niger, took their seats as a single document was placed on the podium, the new Pan-African Manifesto. When the reading began, it was not in the measured tone of bureaucracy, but in the cadence of conviction. The declaration denounced economic recolonization through aid and dependency, and called for an African century built on shared resources, shared defense, and shared dignity. When a delegate from Ghana proclaimed Burkina Faso is no longer a frontier, it is the heartbeat of a new Africa, the room erupted. Applause thundered for nearly 3 minutes, merging with chants of Sankara lives. But outside those walls, reactions were less celebratory. Within hours, major Western outlets, AFP, Reuters, Le Monde, had already issued cautious headlines: Traoré courts, radical Pan, Africanists, new Sahel, Axis challenges, French influence. In Paris, an emergency briefing was called at the Quai d'Orsay. The European Union issued a statement expressing concern over the ideological orientation of Burkina Faso's leadership. In Washington, the event was described as a troubling populist turn. Analytically, this moment crystallized a divide. For the West, it was a rupture. For the Sahel, it was renewal. Burkina Faso, one of Africa's smallest economies and among its most war-torn nations, had just redefined the terms of discourse. Pan-Africanism was no longer the vocabulary of professors or poets. It had become a strategic doctrine, one that threatened to rewire the continent's alliances. The implications were clear. If Traoré succeeded, Ouagadougou could become a new ideological capital, shaping an Africa driven not by aid, but by assertion. If he failed, it would confirm every skeptic's fear that rhetoric alone cannot feed, defend, or unite a continent still bleeding from division. And as I watched the footage again that night, one thought lingered. This was not simply a conference. It was the first open declaration of intellectual independence in modern African politics. The following morning, as the delegates gathered again, the tone shifted from inspiration to architecture. Traoré, standing beside a map of Africa, drawn in bold green lines, presented what he called the continental equation. His voice was calm, but resolute. Unity without production is emotion. Production without sovereignty is slavery. What we need is balance. He outlined a framework in 3 pillars: economic autonomy, collective defense, and cultural reformation. Each one sounded idealistic at first, until the numbers appeared. Burkina Faso, he announced, had already reallocated 12% of its national budget toward industrial and agricultural self-sufficiency. That included investments in seed research, small-scale weapon manufacturing, and renewable energy projects in cooperation with Mali and Niger. Then came the announcement that surprised even seasoned analysts: the launch of a Pan-African Civic Corps, a volunteer initiative meant to link engineers, doctors, teachers, and technicians across borders without waiting for foreign NGOs. "We cannot wait for development to be delivered," Traoré said. "We will build it with those who believe in Africa, not those who profit from it." The crowd rose again. But outside the palace, skepticism persisted. Could a nation still battling insurgency afford to fund continental dreams? Could symbolism be converted into logistics, roads, factories, supply chains? From an analytical perspective, this is where Traoré's vision walks a narrow ridge between strategic genius and overreach. On one hand, he is filling the ideological vacuum left by a discredited elite offering Africa a coherent alternative to dependency. On the other, he is betting that Burkina Faso's moral authority can outweigh its limited material power. Yet this risk is precisely what gives the movement its force. Every revolution in African history, from Nkrumah's Pan-African Congress to Sankara's agrarian reforms, began not with consensus, but with audacity. And in Ouagadougou that week, audacity had become policy. The question now was whether the rest of the continent was ready to follow. The days following the conference were unlike anything Burkina Faso had experienced in recent years. Across African media, from Dakar to Dar es Salaam, headlines echoed the same sentiment: Ouagadougou has spoken. In Bamako, a Malian minister publicly declared that the spirit of Sahel unity has found its flag. In Niamey, the Nigerian government proposed joint agricultural and military training initiatives, inspired by Traoré's model. Even in Ghana, where skepticism towards Sahelian politics is common, student unions organized campus discussions, titled "The New Africa After Ouagadougou." But not every reaction was enthusiastic. In Abuja, some officials warned that military-led ideologies may destabilize democratic norms. In Abidjan, business circles whispered concerns that the Pan-African economic realignment might disrupt French-backed investment structures. As an analyst observing these ripples, one could clearly see the geopolitical chessboard shifting. Traoré's meeting had transformed Burkina Faso, a country of barely 23 million people, into a symbolic hub of continental awakening. The message was contagious. Africa could cooperate without permission. By the end of October, over a dozen Pan-African youth organizations had pledged to collaborate under the new Civic Corps framework. Online, the hashtags #JosherWeBuildAfrica and From Sahel to Sea trended for days, sparking debates about how nations could align their policies outside Western monetary systems. Yet beneath the enthusiasm lies a hard truth: ideology alone cannot irrigate the desert. The challenge ahead was to convert passion into pragmatic partnerships, energy-sharing infrastructure corridors, and local manufacturing chains, the kind of work that demands patience, planning, and trust. Still, for a continent long dismissed as fragmented and dependent, the images from Ouagadougou told a different story: Africans debating their destiny in their own capital, in their own languages, under their own flag. And for that reason alone, the world was forced to pay attention. In Paris, the tone was far less poetic. Within 48 hours of the conference, the French intelligence brief described the Ouagadougou summit as a consolidation of anti-Western ideology under the guise of Pan-Africanism. A private memo leaked to Le Monde warned that a regional doctrine of strategic autonomy could threaten France's remaining influence in the Sahel. The response from Washington was more cautious, but no less concerned. A U.S. State Department spokesperson noted that Burkina Faso's new alliances must remain within the framework of democratic cooperation. Translated into plain English, it meant, don't leave our orbit completely. From my standpoint as an analyst, this marked a critical inflection point. For decades, Africa's global relationships were structured around conditional support, aid, military assistance, or trade agreements that preserved dependency. The Ouagadougou meeting inverted that logic. Instead of asking what Africa needs, Traoré asked what Africa already has. The problem for the West is not the rhetoric itself, but its potential replication. If one small, landlocked country can defy traditional power hierarchies and survive, others might follow. And once a narrative of self-sufficiency gains emotional legitimacy, even economic sanctions lose their moral leverage. By mid-October, European analysts were already mapping possible containment measures, delaying aid disbursements, restricting technology exports, and discouraging private investment in the Sahel bloc. Yet these moves only reinforced the perception that Western powers feared and empowered Africa more than a stable one. In media commentary, the tone hardened. Western think tanks called Traoré a populist soldier wrapped in revolutionary myth. African outlets responded by labeling those same critics as the last missionaries of dependency. The result was clear: a rhetorical Cold War had begun, not between states, but between visions of the continent's future. On one side, the old equation, aid for loyalty. On the other, the new one, sovereignty for survival. And somewhere in the middle stood Burkina Faso, small, poor, surrounded by threats, but for the first time speaking in a voice loud enough for the world to hear. Inside, Burkina Faso enthusiasm and tension coexist. While the international spotlight praised Traoré's audacity, local analysts were quick to remind that idealism must meet infrastructure. The Pan-African project may have captured hearts, but the Burkinabe economy is still fighting drought, inflation, and insecurity. In the capital, civil servants quietly ask how these grand alliances will translate into better hospitals, paved roads, and stable prices. The Ministry of Finance faces a delicate equation, balancing defense spending, agricultural investment, and social welfare under severe budgetary pressure. A senior economist from Ouagadougou put it bluntly: "We cannot build a new Africa if the lights go out at night." Even within the army, Traoré's traditional bastion of support, there are murmurs about resource allocation. The new armored vehicles, drones, and logistics reforms have improved morale, but sustaining them requires constant funding. Without private sector participation and regional coordination, the machine may slow before it truly runs. Then there's the human element. Many Burkinabe admire Traoré's courage, but fear the risk of over-centralization. Critics argue that genuine Pan-Africanism cannot rely on one charismatic figure. It must evolve into institutions capable of surviving beyond him. From a strategic point of view, this is the paradox of revolutionary leadership. The same personal authority that unites people in crisis can later limit pluralism. If Burkina Faso wants to lead by example, it must turn inspiration into administration, build systems that outlive slogans. And yet, even among skeptics, one fact is undeniable. For the first time in decades, Burkina Faso is not defined by its struggles, but by its ambitions. That psychological shift from dependency to design may prove to be Traoré's most enduring reform. By late October 2025, the Pan-African wave that began in Ouagadougou had evolved from a symbolic summit into a regional experiment. Delegations from Mali, Niger, Chad, and Guinea signed preliminary accords to coordinate infrastructure corridors, energy grids, and agricultural research. Some called it the Sahel Renaissance. Satellite imagery showed what words alone could not: hundreds of new solar installations under joint AES funding, cross-border irrigation pipelines, under survey, and shared command centers, integrating security data between the Sahel states. The movement that had begun with slogans was slowly turning into logistics. International analysts, long skeptical of the Sahel's stability, began to recalibrate their models. What they saw was not a perfect union, but a strategic awakening. If the alliance endures, it could redefine West Africa's geopolitical weight, shifting the axis of influence from the coast to the desert. From my perspective, this is the moment when the idea of Burkina Faso transcends its borders. Traoré's revolution is no longer just about his nation's sovereignty. It is about reconfiguring the psychological geography of an entire continent. Africa, for once, is not reacting to history. It is writing it. But the road ahead remains steep. Global markets, entrenched interests, and old alliances will resist this change. The test for Traoré and his peers will not be in their rhetoric, but in their capacity to maintain cooperation without coercion, to keep faith without fanaticism, and to transform moral power into material progress. In the end, the real measure of this new Pan-Africanism will not be how loudly it speaks, but how long it lasts. And as the drums of Ouagadougou faded into the desert night, one could sense that something irreversible had begun, a shift from dependence to destiny.